Market.
Take one, roll 4, interview with Jack Gulley.
And camera 3.
A number of journalists have said that the ABC was the only Australian news organisation to attempt to cover the Vietnam War independently of overseas sources. Were you happy with the coverage the ABC gave to the war?
No, I wasn't. We did cover it independently of the American networks and BizNews, the International News Film Agency, but while we had a reporter there most of the time, we had limited camera coverage. In retrospect, we could have had more camera coverage in Vietnam.
And why wasn't there a permanent cameraman based in Saigon with a journalist?
A number of reasons for this, mainly finance, lack of resources. It would have cost us quite a lot of money to have had a camera crew permanently based in Vietnam. Secondly, we were getting a reasonably adequate coverage from the American networks and from BizNews.
Do you think, though, since we got it from the American networks, it was more how the Americans saw the war rather than this independent Australian angle?
I think, again, in retrospect, this is probably true, and I think a lot of the war was uncovered. It's only since the war ended that some of the truth is coming out about the stories that were not covered by the American networks and by the agencies. Situations such as My Lai, for instance, were not covered at the time, and I think a lot of those atrocity-type situations were not covered by the American media at the time.
In retrospect, then, could you say that the ABC really didn't live up to its responsibility in covering the war or informing public opinion?
That's being a little hard. I think that we, as far as reporters were concerned, we had reporters there all the time, and the war was fairly well covered from that point of view. But again, I would say that a lot of the information about the war came from American sources in Saigon, from American Army headquarters, and this did tend to give a biased and somewhat distorted account of what was happening during the war. This has become quite apparent since the war.
Was there any attempt at the time to try and adjust for this propaganda that was being put out by the Americans?
I don't think we realised it was propaganda. A typical instance of this sort of situation was when CBS's Walter Cronkite went into Vietnam and saw for himself what was happening when the Marines were setting fire to Vietnamese villages. The CBS coverage of the war changed dramatically from that point, and there's some suggestion that the whole thrust of American public opinion changed from that time.
Did you get any feedback at all from the journalists, aside from what they reported on camera or on radio, in terms of what was really happening up there?
No. What they told me privately corresponded with what they actually saw. The fact that they did not see a lot of things that were happening there was not their fault.
How would you explain it then?
I think that the Americans did not allow access to certain things that were happening in Vietnam. It's as simple as that.
I've interviewed Don Simmons, and he went out into the field quite a bit, but he says that he was criticised by management back in Australia because he wasn't able to always keep contact with a home base. What do you make of that criticism?
I wasn't aware of that. We realise that reporters in situations such as Vietnam do get away from base. They do have to go up country, and I wouldn't think it would be a point of criticism as far as he's concerned.
In terms of making an interpretation of what was happening there, there doesn't seem to have been until very late in the piece much opportunity for ABC journalists to say exactly how they felt about the war, what was happening in terms that wouldn't be regarded as being objective. Why does the ABC maintain or insist upon this objectivity?
It's part of our basic policy is to be factual and objective, and we don't like subjective opinions of reporters to be intruded into what they are reporting. We feel that if reporters have something to say, they should say it and not allow their own personal feelings to colour what they're saying.
If they were to say, though, for instance, that the war was futile or it couldn't be won, that wouldn't have been used on ABC, would it, on the news?
It may not have been used in news because, again, we regard this as a subjective attitude. It's an editorial comment, it's a personal opinion by one reporter. It's not news as such.
What effect do you think television had on public opinion?
I think it had, as in America, it had a considerable impact on public opinion. It's described as the first lounge room war, of course, and this applied to some extent in Australia as well as the United States.
Given that fact, then, why didn't the ABC see it as important enough to have a cameraman up there who could cover the war and give, as we said, an independent Australian version of the war?
Well, it's pretty hard to give an independent version of a war. The press corps as such moved around en masse most of the time. The fact that we were getting coverage, as I said, from 3 American networks and from Viz News and CBS, which were the 2 agencies we were taking at the time, gave us a reasonable coverage. You must recall too that most of the film shot in Vietnam was satellited out, and to be competitive with that we would have had a satellite out too, which would have been a very expensive operation.
How much would it cost to have a cameraman in the field for a year? In
Saigon, in Vietnam, at this distance it's hard to say. I wouldn't take a stab at it here, but the ABC does have to provide accommodation and all sorts of other additional facilities, and it would have been a fairly expensive operation. But again, let me say that while we didn't have a cameraman permanently based there, we did send camera crews in from time to time.
Mm-hmm. And this wouldn't really allow any continuity though, would it, in terms that there were just swan tours in and out, and couldn't really get a feel for it or establish any feel for what was happening in terms of, say, Australian involvement there?
Well, that may be partly true, but we did have a fair turnover of journalists there too. We didn't have anyone there right throughout the war. We had quite a number of journalists in there.
Was this a conscious policy on the ABC's part, or did the journalists themselves decide they didn't want to stay there?
No, we gave people tours of duty in Vietnam, as we do in other overseas posts.
Well, do you think in terms of continuity and allowing them to find out what's happening and establish a certain amount of expertise on an area, it would have been better to leave one man covering it for more than 1 year?
Some of them were there longer than for 1 year. Don Simmons, one of our main reporters there, was there much longer than 1 year. The longer you stay in the place, perhaps sometimes you get too close to the situation. So in some ways it's probably better to have some turnover and to have a fresh approach.
What sort of response did you get from the public in the ABC's coverage of the war in terms of feedback?
That's hard to say. I think some people, from letters and phone calls and so on that we had, were horrified at certain incidents that occurred during the war. I recall one particular incident when General Lone shot a Viet Cong officer through the head in one of in the streets of Saigon. I came in on a Sunday afternoon to look at this film, and it was fairly horrifying. The man was shot through the head and fell to the ground with a fountain of blood spurting out of his head. We had to make a decision whether to run this or not.
How did you feel about that decision to run it?
I felt we should run it. It showed what was happening in Saigon, and this is in partial answer to your earlier question. I felt that we did not censor any film coming out of Vietnam. We did show incidents of this kind.
What was the feedback from Canberra? Did they get annoyed at the fact that you'd showed that? Politicians?
No, I had no one in ABC management supported me in fact showing that kind of film.
You say you didn't censor any material, but Tony Ferguson, who was up there in 1966, got an interview with Wilfrid Burchett. Now he claims that the film sent back to Australia was destroyed, not used because Burchett was too hot politically.
The Burchett film was not used, that's true, and an editorial decision was made above my level not to use it.
Why was that?
I think because Burchett was a well-known communist and was regarded in some areas as a traitor, and therefore it was decided that it was not appropriate to show the film. It was not my decision. Did you agree with that decision? No, I didn't.
Burchett nevertheless was presenting another side of the war, one that wasn't covered by the Western journalists. He and a Frenchman were the only ones there. With the ABC priding itself on its objectivity, wouldn't it have had a responsibility to show how he viewed the war, given the fact you had an experienced journalist like Ferguson interviewing him?
As I said, my personal view is that we should have shown the film because it showed the other side of the war, quite disregarding what Burchett's political commitment was one way or the other. My personal view was that we should have shown it.
Was that the only instance where film was dropped?
There were one or two minor instances where film was not used because it was too horrifying to show people at that time in the evening. This was mainly Viz News film, which the commercials didn't use either. This kind of film showed close-ups of dead bodies with eyes gouged out and things, rather horrible things of that nature. We decided we would not show those.
Okay, good.